NASA have ways of making you think correctly because they can show you all the things they've done, like landing on the moon, allegedly. Oh, dear. Did you see Bart Sibrel's appearance on Joe Rogan?
Yep.
I thought Bart came across very well on that.
Oh, yeah. No, he did.
Joe was certainly challenging him, which is what Joe does, in a very polite and respectful way.
Didn't Bart have to go to his studio? Don't you
Yep.
have to go to Joe Rogan's studio?
Yeah. Is it Austin that Joe works from?
Yeah, I talked to Bart the day after we were talking there. He emailed me and I got on with him. And he said that Joe invited him right out of the blue.
Well, there's obviously a lot of interest in the subject. It's good that he was there because Bart made a very strong case for his position. And he's been involved in that for 25 years? More than 25 years?
It was good because what he did was Joe Rogan tried to pull that same stunt that he does with, like everyone else tries to do. They have an Apollo 12, Apollo 14 flag, and of course the astronaut setting it up. He has his hand on it and he's turning it, and people are saying, "Oh, you see that? It's waving in the air. There's air blowing by." But Bart said, "Oh, just 1 minute here. Hey, Jamie, can you please pull up the Apollo 15 footage that I gave you?" And then he ran it. And it's the first time Joe ever saw that astronaut walk by the flag and it starts waving.
Yeah.
That's the first time he showed it. And I'm going, oh, thank heaven. Because Fox tried pulling the same stunt with the flag. Remember that? Their hands are on the flag. Of course it's going to move. They're twisting it into that little tube they have already previously pounded in the ground. So of course it's going to wave. Oh, but when you let your hands off of it, it won't wave anymore because there's no wind. Well, try to explain the one with the astronaut in Apollo 15 walking by it. And then what happens is you get guys like Brian Pop Robson who say, well, I did all the calculations in the pendulum and I did all that and the physics equations, and it says that, yeah, I worked it all out here. Yeah, the movement is like a pendulum, and yeah, it's in 1/6 gravity. And I'm going, okay, well, then try to explain how when that astronaut walks by that flag, it starts waving. Oh, well, that's because you see over here in this document, it says that just as they were doing that, he was walking by, air was released from the hatch. And then the other one was, oh, well, there was reserve air that they were letting out of the tank, and it came out and it blew the flag. And I'm going, well, that's pretty hard to do. How are you going to let the air out when both of those guys are on the surface? He just saluted the flag over there while this guy just walked by it. So both of them were out in the surface. Who just let the air out of that ship? And where did that air come from when the doors open?
Exactly. The idea that the air released from the lunar lander, the idea that that can then be sufficiently powerful to move the flag, which is a considerable distance away from the lander, about 75 feet, that rather puts a kibosh on the whole idea that there was no blast crater under the lander. That was far more powerful blast from the rocket. Whether it was throttled back to 10% power doesn't really matter.
Well, the stuff coming out of the rocket is traveling at just over 3 kilometers per second as it's exiting. It's quite a bit different than a little thing, even if it's under 100 psi, releasing the air coming out.
Yeah, but wasn't it so convenient that the release valve from the lunar lander was pointing directly at the flag? So it moved. I mean, that must have required a lot of pre-planning to get the release valve to point directly at the flag, 75 feet away from the lander, and consider that the two can match. Of course they can't.
Well, he said it disperses.
Of course it disperses. It disperses all over the place because there's nothing to hold it in.
Right, so why is there not a crater down there? As a matter of fact, you would think you would see something down there of some little pattern, something down there of that dust blown away, if in fact that lander landed on hard rock or hard pan. We don't see any of that, nothing. And yet in one of the other photographs, we see that it looks like someone took a shovel and dug underneath the engine after the thing had been placed down by a crane. Yeah. It's just the craziest stuff. And then when they take off, what was it, Apollo 15 again? When they take off, look at the flag. It's blowing all over the place. Crap's blowing off the LEM. Pieces of foam are flying off the LEM and blowing in the direction of the engine blast. When you fire an engine off, or when they lit the engine, let's say, It goes out in a radial pattern. Why is everything only flying out in one direction?
Because that's where the camera was set up.
Exactly.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, that's something I noticed this morning when I was looking at this. I'm going, wait a minute. They have the camera in the window. That's fine. But when they take off, all you see is everything being blown in one direction. There was some foam that was on the rear of that thing. It broke off and went flying right into the front, came up, rolled around by the window, and then flew off in that direction. That makes no sense because they light the engine, it's radial. It's going to come out in all directions, not just in one direction and blow everything off in one direction. That makes no sense.
And also, don't forget that when the ascent stage engine fired up, there was nowhere for the exhaust gases to go. There was no hole underneath it for the exhaust gas to be directed. When it fired up, 3,500 pounds of pressure, when it fired up, there's supposed to be a hole in the lander, in the descent stage of the lander, for the exhaust gas to be dispersed, but there isn't.
That's where the descent stage engine is located.
Exactly, yeah.
You would have to remove the descent stage engine so that it would have a passage for the exhaust to come through.
Yeah, it would need something there.
Look at how those things are stacked on top of one another. That engine is basically right up in against the ascent stage bell housing.
That seems to be a bit of an omission in terms of the design, because nobody would put a rocket on top of a flat surface with no position, nowhere for the exhaust. When the rocket is fired up, nowhere for it to go. And you can see it in the schematics of the lander. There isn't anywhere for the exhaust gas to go. So when it fires up, it's got to overcome 1/6 gravity, we're told, and it's got to lift about 3 or 4 tons. It would take a little while to build up sufficient power in the ascent stage rocket for it to be able to lift off.
Neither
But-
just goes pop.
I mean, it's like a champagne cork coming out of a bottle. Straight up. Ding, wow, magic. And we're not supposed to question it. We're not supposed to ask questions. That's all we do. We ask questions. How did this hypergolic fueled rocket engine of the ascent stage have sufficient power to lift several tons of the ascent stage against 1/6 gravity with nowhere for the exhaust to go? I mean, that's the whole point. That's what destroyed recent launches on Earth. They didn't have anywhere for the exhaust to go, so the launch site got badly damaged.
Oh, I have a great idea. I have a fantastic idea to solve that. Why don't they just put down one of those deflector shields that they had for the V2 rockets like I showed in the last video? You know, you just go buy one and you place it right down and then the LEM can land on it and then you don't have any problem.
That's probably what they did. In fact, that was the question that Peter Bassett asked me, trying to demonstrate how there wasn't any hole under a rocket launch. He said, well, look, the V2 rockets took off. They didn't leave a crater in the ground once they'd taken off. I said, no, they had a deflector shield. It weighed about a ton underneath the rocket, which you showed in that film. I thought it was very good. He didn't know about that. He didn't know that V2 rockets had a deflector shield underneath them to deflect the exhaust away. The ascent stage of the lunar lander doesn't have a deflector shield underneath. It just has the top of the descent stage. That's not a deflector shield. That's a design error, major design problem, because the temperature of the ascent stage engine would be sufficient to melt aluminium once the thing had taken off. It builds up the pressure to allow sufficient energy to launch several tons of the ascent stage against 1/6 gravity. Where did the exhaust go? It didn't.
Let me ask you a question then. Those guys are inside of that LEM in an atmosphere now because it's pressurized. The suits are laying outside on the grounds with the PLSSs. They have nothing in there. So I wonder how much heat is that engine producing inside of that ship because they're sitting on it.
And you can't hear a single sound of the engine.
Nothing.
So if the astronauts are not wearing their spacesuits in the ascent stage, they've got atmosphere around them which would allow sound to be heard. Oh no, they said they've got their little microphones close to their mouth. Yes, they have, in their spacesuit. There's a big discrepancy here between what should have happened and what we were shown happened.
They could be wearing their spacesuits inside the craft. They have a tether to them. They don't need the PLSS. They could pressurize it independently. They could have their spacesuits on, and they could get oxygen within the craft for a limited amount that it takes them to get up into orbit and dock.
Yeah.
That's not a problem that way. But when you're talking about the heat, the hull of the vessel you're talking about is only 12 millimeters thick. And you're getting a blast coming down and blowing back. Just the pressure alone would blow the hull.
Yeah, it would. That's quite a powerful engine they're using, the 3,500 pound thrust
It's
engine.
the speed that the exhaust is coming off at.
Yeah.
It's the expansion of the gases, which are 12,500 miles an hour is the expansion rate, which is much faster than the speed of sound. That's why you hear rockets taking off with that expansion rate, that you can't actually capture the sound correctly using a microphone because it's above the speed of sound. You get that crackling effect. But when they put all of their documents together, and there's so many errors in them, just complete number of errors, they did not look at the fact that the descent stage, it is their launch pad. So they should be able to level it, number one. Number two, they need to have a deflector around to shoot the gases out around that engine, or remove the descent stage engine to have a path for the ascent stage for that to happen.
Yeah.
They also needed the deflector shields above that on the ascent stage so that no blast can go back up against the hull, that it can't push back because the hull was so delicate. Well, the hull just doesn't work, period. You can't pressurize that. You can't do anything in a vacuum. That's just a complete error. One of the other errors on the descent stage is when they landed, and it's in the documentation, that they used a explosive charge to get rid of any residual fuel in the descent stage tanks. And that's all fine and dandy to use an explosive charge to cut open a line to drain them. But to save weight, they use one charge and cut all four lines to the tanks together. So all four lines are together when they cut them. This hypergolic fuel, when they mix, it's going to light.
Yeah, that's true.
And they just forgot about that part when they were designing that piece of it. It's one thing to depressurize, evacuate that remaining fuel for safety reasons in the descent stage, but you can't do all four together with one explosive charge to cut the lines. That doesn't work because it's going to light fire. You're going to see that. That's just while it's sitting there. After they landed, they vent the tanks. And to vent the tanks, they used an explosive charge and cut all four lines to the tanks, so they have to be right tight together. It's going to light up. You're going to see it. It'd be one thing if they were separated around, but they didn't do that. They claimed that they used an explosive charge to vent them all at the same time. Just little technical errors within the documentation. And then, of course, we have the full error on takeoff. Here's something else that nobody thought about was they claim that they did a docking, undocking in space. They're in low Earth orbit, so they pull them out. They're traveling at the same speed. They're right together. They do that turnaround and dock the two together. But they never, ever had one orbiting the Earth and shot another one up to dock with it. And that's a huge difference. The timing, everything else. And of course, we don't see that timing coming off the moon. I mean, they throw a tape in. Here we go off into the wild blue yonder. There's no countdown. There's no nothing, right? Well, apparently they've got a countdown, but there's no documentation before. One of the missions, they've included the countdown, updated file.
Again?
Yes.
An interesting film I watched last night about the Inspector General's report into the Artemis program. It's just been published. And one of the points they're looking at is the damage to the Orion heat shield on the most recent return of the Orion craft, which was after the Artemis 1 launch. And the heat shield was severely damaged. And they show the pictures of it. Great chunks coming out of the heat shield of the Orion craft. We're now going up to the 21st century. The return to the moon. The Orion craft, which is supposed to be Apollo 2.0, the photographs showing the heat shield after it returned to Earth, after the Orion craft returned to Earth, show great chunks torn out of the heat shield. Fortunately, it wasn't enough to destroy the craft. But an even more important point that the Inspector General's report highlights, which I'd never heard mentioned before. You remember the Orion craft and the Apollo craft are linked together to the service module. The Orion craft or the Apollo craft have to have large metal bolts linking.
Oh, yes, where the two connect.
The report makes very clear that the damage on these connection points was severe. And you can see in the photographs that they published in the Inspector General's report that the hole through the heat shield to link the command module, in this case Orion, to the service module, virtually went through into the Orion craft.
The heat's going to transfer through because you don't have any insulation, nothing. You don't have, the heat shield isn't there. You got a piece of steel that has to connect with another piece of steel.
So anybody saying that radiation doesn't harm humans, radiation comes from the sun. It damages humans. It damages our DNA. So the idea that radiation cannot harm humans or you need protection against it is very real.
And what about these x-rays? I'm looking at this animal show. This woman goes and wants to x-ray a cat, just a little cat. And I go, okay, something's wrong here. These guys have more lead aprons on than they do for a dental x-ray. And they're just taking an x-ray of a cat.
X-rays are damaging. So you've got to be protected. So how were the astronauts protected in space?
Those are the same x-rays that they used to x-ray the suits, right? That you can see right through the suit. And those are the protective suits with all their protective layering. And an x-ray just goes straight on through. Beautiful.
Straight through. That's what x-rays do. They're very useful.
That interview was interesting too, how Bart was talking about that radiation. Because Joe asked Bart, what did they have for protection? Bart says, nothing. What did they have? And he says, well, they had that little thin piece of aluminum that they called the limb. And Joe's just sitting there, kind of scratches his head and he's thinking, and then Bart kind of goes on to the fact that, okay, wait a minute here, aluminum? Well, I don't know. Have you ever put tin foil into a microwave oven and turned it on? The outcome's not very good, is it? In other words, it just reflects the electric, it excites them even more.
Yeah, it does.
So all that cosmic radiation and that deep space radiation and the CMEs and everything that's coming off of the sun, what do you think's going to happen when all of that stuff hits that aluminum hull? It's going to excite all the electrons and it's going to cook you.
Yeah, exactly. Of course it's going to cook you. And what the pro-NASA supporters say is it's different types of radiation, as if that dismisses it. Of course it's different types of radiation. Galactic cosmic rays, gamma radiation, X-rays, solar radiation, they're all different frequencies.
Yeah, really nasty stuff.
It's very nasty stuff. You're quite right. So what protection was offered to the astronauts? None. There is no protection in the spacesuits.
Here's these beautiful Apollo spacesuits. They take an X-ray of it and you could see every stitch in that spacesuit right to the other side of the wall. Yeah, and that's going to protect them?
When you start getting exposed to gamma rays, which are even higher frequency than X-rays, you're going to get serious problems for humans. Humans are not designed to survive in that type of environment. That's why we have protection here on Earth. The atmosphere, the Van Allen belts. Humans are not designed to go into space unprotected, but they weren't protected on Apollo.
Well, gamma rays and that, they physically damage the cells in the body.
Yeah, they do. Seriously, they damage the DNA.
Another thing that we were discussing was these satellites to detect these coronal mass ejections, these CMEs. Well, when they place these satellites out there, like the SOHO, for example, the flare comes off the sun. Satellite detects it. Then it's going to take how long for that transmission to reach Earth so that somebody can do something about it? It's going to take 8 minutes.
It's 8 minutes from the sun.
That's right.
Traveling at the speed of light. The first blast coming off an X-class CME is the radiation. If you put a satellite out in the Lagrange zone, the L zone, which is 1 million miles out from the Earth, and it has the early detection devices aboard on the thing, when it sends the signal back, it's only sending the signal back at the same speed that the radiation is arriving.
So the radiation is going to get there the same time that they receive the signal.
Yeah.
So what happens to these poor people that are going to be supposedly floating around this gateway station? So a solar flare comes along, and they're going to know about it at the same time that it hits them. So what good is it going to do? They have no chance to even hide anywhere. Well, they can't hide anywhere anyways, because all they're going to do is hide in a bunch of water containers, and they think that's going to work. I would like to know how they're going to get that water up there. Or are they going to urinate into bags and then push that inside the walls and call that radiation protection? Because I could see that coming next as an excuse.
But even a million miles out there, even if it was giving you an early detection, which it can't, you're only talking about 10 seconds.
Yes, but what about that article we were looking at yesterday that was going over such a thing? Remember the article? It said something about when these solar flares hit, it's going to cook you. Any astronaut that's outside on the lunar surface, or whether they're inside of a space station, or whether it doesn't matter, they're going to be cooked.
So if you look at the second paragraph underneath the image, it says the electromagnetic radiation travels at the speed of light, reaching Earth in just over 8 minutes. Right? CME travels at a more leisurely pace, relatively speaking, right, and can take 15 to 19 hours to get here. But what good is that satellite sitting a million miles out? The serious radiation that's going to kill you is traveling at the same speed that you're going to be able to send the signal back. So there is no early detection. You can get the same information from Earth. You don't need to have a satellite out there whatsoever.
Well, that's something to think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'd like to see how Phase and those clowns are going to explain that one.
So, is there an actual satellite a million miles out?
Well, it sounds impressive, doesn't it?
And how hardened would it have to be? They're claiming like that satellite is completely hardened to handle this kind of stuff. And it's just been getting bombarded with CMEs in the last 6-8 months or year, actually, right? We've had quite a few. And one that's at this level that we just had. The Aurora Borealis was absolutely incredible right around the world.
It was. I saw it down here in England, South England.
You can see it in London, right?
Yeah, see it in London. Yeah. So what was happening on the International Space Station? They must have had a wonderful view of it.
They should have shut down and hid behind all their excrement bags, covered themselves in it,
And they probably got stuck around the water bottles to make sure it didn't hurt them.
The problem is they have zero warning for the radiation.
Well, that's true.
And that's what this article is stating, right? The radiation comes out at the speed of light. So the early detection can't give you an early detection because you can only send the signal. Doesn't matter how far you put that satellite out there. It can't travel any faster than, it's probably a delay because it has to analyze it first and then send it, or get fried in the process. 10 seconds is nothing.
Well, it's not even enough time to get around the water bottles, is it? No. Assuming you've got them all ready to get into.
How are they going to get all that water up there in the first place? I mean, all of the fuel that they're going to be ferrying up there, according to Destin at Smarter Every Day, it's going to take 15 to 20. And if you take a look at what Thunderfoot put up, it's going to take 30 now to get to the moon and back. That's just the fuel. Well, what about the water? It weighs the same. There's not much difference in weight. So what are they going to do for water? Are they going to ferry up another, 10 of these starships filled with water? Or are they going to claim that they can just make it out of the oxygen that they already have in the system, and they just make water out of thin air like they do everywhere else?
Or maybe they use their urine.
Well, yeah, that's what I said. That's going to be the next excuse. They're just going to fill up the urine bags and then place it inside the wall, and then when the CME hits, to go hide. Well, that'll be the next one for the lunar station, gateway station. That's how they're going to do it. You watch. Because they don't have any other excuse.
I still don't understand why they need all these, was it 15 different rocket launches to fuel the thing? Why do they need them? They haven't explained that yet.
Why didn't they need them before?
Exactly. Apollo didn't need them. Interesting, that.
Didn't need a gateway station either.
No, they didn't. Maybe they found actually do need a gateway station, and Apollo was fake.
Yeah, but look at what happened with Werner von Braun. He said the same thing. Yeah, look at his space station. That's where they go to refuel the ships. You see all the little fuel pods on the outside of the station, and their ships are backing up to it and refueling and then going to the moon. Well, the space station he's showing is a round circular space station, somewhat like Space Odyssey 2001. That's where you go to refuel. And all that fuel has been ferried up already, and this station is orbiting the moon. With, of course, no shielding or anything like that. So all these meteorites and micrometeorites are going to come and smash their way right through their Whipple shield or no Whipple shield. Right? Yeah, we're talking about how many times faster than the speed of a bullet that those little microparticles are going. And what about the astronauts on the surface of the moon? A Whipple shield and all those layers that they built up in the Apollo spacesuit that we see them doing on these videos, you tend to tell me that's going to work against a guy firing a little particle at that spacesuit? I've never seen them do it. Now, that's another thing we haven't seen them do yet, have we? Firing something at that spacesuit to see if it doesn't go through to the other side.
Well, they can't fire anything as fast as the stuff. Some of the particles, like, you're into several 100,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, but look what it does to materials, aluminum, metal, steel, when they fire a bullet through it. And not only bullets, but then they take grains of sand and they fire that through. And look at the damage it does. It goes right through the other side. They put it in those high-speed velocity guns and they vacuum out all of the air and then they fire it. And these things are going thousands of miles an hour. And the damage they do when they hit the other side is something else.
It's the same way they were testing aircraft windshields to make sure that they would be not affected by birds striking them. So they fired these chickens at them, and they all shattered, completely shattered. They said, no, you're not supposed to fire frozen chickens at them, live ones.
Yeah, and then everybody went to Swiss Chalet.
Obviously, they learned from their mistakes. Oh, Toyota will put the Land Cruiser on the moon. Oh, good.
John Cadden does a beautiful job on the Toyota Land Cruiser. And he's saying it took them 10 years to develop the Land Cruiser, but Toyota is going to have one by the end of 2029. They're going to have this thing on the moon, and it's a monster. This thing's 25 feet high. Even gives the description.
When it was first announced, I sent an email saying, have you tested it in a vacuum chamber? Didn't hear back, so I assume they must have done.
Well, this machine is now completely pressurized all the time. I assume it's got an airlock on it and everything else. It's got brake lights on it, too.
Oh, good.
Toyota Land Cruiser. What do you need brake lights for? Any more than signal lights?
Well, so that ET knows when you're going to slow down, presumably.
Yeah. He goes into that.
Let's have a look. It sounds good.
I've shown this many times, this crazy rover, in other videos.
Yeah, but they're pushing it now. They got Toyota involved. Toyota's going to build this.
Oh, no, Toyota was always the first that was going to build this.
Yeah.
Well, good choice of company. See that Toyota are now being rather magnanimous about the fact that they didn't go down the electric vehicle route, the EV route. And they're not saying, well, we told you so, as everybody goes belly up because they can't afford it. Toyota said, no, we just produce what our customers want. And they produce hybrids. They're the world's leading company with hybrid vehicles. Very good system.
But what Cadden was saying is it took more than 10 years to develop the Land Cruiser, the Toyota Land Cruiser, and that they're going to put this thing together, in the next 4 or 5 years and have it ready to go. It's quite hilarious when you start thinking about it in that aspect.
Yeah, because this is more complicated.
Right.
It's more complicated than a car.
And a hell of a lot bigger.
Yeah.
This thing's probably going to be at least 20 ton before it's fueled. And how many rockets is that going to take?
Oh, dear.
That's just unbelievable. Of course, Musk is going to come back. You watch in the next couple of weeks. He's going to come back and he's going to build a Cybertruck to be on the moon as well.
It's what happens when you get billionaires competing on these high-stake games. Musk will send a Cybertruck. NASA will try and send a Toyota Moon Cruiser, or whatever they're going to call it.
Well, that's JAXA's doing this one.
Well, JAXA's the Japanese.
So NASA is going to have to stay with GM.
There will, yes, it could be a competition to see who can get the best moon truck. Quite how they'll sell it, I don't know. It makes for good publicity. It's the same old story. But they've got to solve the problem of their heat shield. Otherwise, they're not going to get the astronauts back again, are they? The Office of Inspector General looking at the result of the heat shield failure on the Orion capsule. Great chunks of it coming off. So they've got to solve that one. Why don't they use what they used on Apollo? They didn't flake off, did it? Oh, they've lost the formula. Again.
Well, they've got the formula. We found all the videos on them and the description and the chemical compounds of it and how it's applied, how it's manufactured, and how it's installed on the vehicle. All those videos are there from MIT.
Yeah, AFCOT 5061, I think it was, the final formulation. And that worked. Well, obviously, the astronauts survived. Very few people actually know that the way that the service module of any spacecraft is connected to the command module, people don't know how that works. You get steel bolts going through the heat shield to hold the service module and the command module together while they're in space.
And they're bolted together, and when they separate, they use explosive bolts to separate them.
But you've still got the bolt going through the heat shield. So how do you get around that? Because the bolt will burn off much faster than the heat shield will. You just get one hole in the wrong place, which happened on Columbia, and the whole thing is destroyed. Same thing with a command module. You get a hole in the heat shield, unless it's properly sealed, which it obviously wasn't on the test, and the thing is actually destroyed by the heat. They're going to have to sort that out, because no astronaut who understands the problem will go anywhere near it. They'd be dead before they got back.